Hello, everyone. This is your host Pranav. Welcome and thanks for joining us again for part 2. We are picking up right where we left off in part 1. I hope that you enjoyed it so far. So please stay tuned as we continue further on this episode.
Use the skills that my ancestors have given me and to find my passions in sharing these gifts to the people that I serve. And I would wish this for everybody. So for me, my passion has been stars and stones and dreams. And I didn't, like you said, I didn't know what it meant. I didn't have the context. But then when I went through this graduate program for 7 years, and then I taught students. Every single student, I must have taught 50 students at the time, and every single student said to me, I've been thinking about all these things that you're talking about, but I didn't know how they were connected. And then when you talk about it, I began to connect the dots. And that's the point. That's what was done for me. I didn't know why I was dreaming about tribal people. I didn't know why I wanted to take off in a ship and go to a star system of Sirius and why I had a map of Sirius. I didn't know. And then when I walk into the room and there is a room full of people that know what I'm talking about, even if I don't, and I get the acknowledgement that would constantly say to me, you are on track. You are on track. My kapuna always told me, you are on track. So we don't have those guideposts in our lives as those who have been dissociated or disconnected from our elders and our tribal knowledge. We haven't been raised in a tribal community. That doesn't romanticize a tribal community. Tribal communities are still dealing with the effects of colonization and genocide in a completely different way than me as a non-native person, I can't even comprehend. So I don't want to romanticize Indigenous. There's still decolonization work in Indigenous. But where I am going is that I'm allowing myself to have a passion and a knowing about these topics and further explore them and find people I can communicate with to have dialogue so I can figure out what it means. And then when I get to a place of meaning and understanding, then part of me begins to unfold. And that unfolding is really where the Indigenous science knowledge comes from. So all these things that you have inquiry about, you already have within you the knowing of what it means. You've just not been raised like me or surrounded by people in a way that what you're talking about has meaning and matters. If I was raised in a tribal community and I was a young kid and I came out with these maps that I was drawing of star systems, they would immediately pronto put me over on the job site of, having to align and connect these sacred structures. It's like, but my skill set hasn't been utilized in so many hundreds of years because of colonization, that now through decolonization, I'm able to peel back those layers, and the excitement and the passion I have for sacred sites and star knowledge now has context and meaning because my ancestors built those sites. It's exciting to me because I participated in creating what that place means. We talked yesterday about one of the Indigenous science precepts being that past, present, and future coexist simultaneously. This is across the board in Indigenous cultures. Time, the element of time is a social construct. So the clock, the Gregorian calendar, all of these things are very modern social constructs that are not natural to our earth-based ways of knowing. So if we're able to step out of time and step out of linear thinking through what I feel is a genuine process, which is decolonization, we can recover a more liberating, I feel, sense of the cycles of time and what it means. So I less look at a clock and I more look at where we're at in the cycle of the year. Where's the solstice? Where's the equinox? Where's the full moon? Where is the new moon? What are the tides doing? What are the plants doing? What flowers are in bloom? What herbs can we pick? It's like that's a more natural rhythm of, for me, being a healthy human and mother than constantly wearing a watch, going by the time clock, having to be somewhere and busy and do that thing. So finding that bridge between the two, my passion for archaeoastronomy and Indigenous science never left me. And because of that passion, I was able to connect into a program that allowed me to think this way and really explore it, which I would wish upon anybody that finds the spark that you and I have and can follow it.
Yeah, and from the modern times, if I talk about quantum physics, is there an element of quantum physics in indigenous science?
Well, yeah, the story that I briefly mentioned is my graduate doctoral chair, Dr. Colorado. She brought in this term Indigenous Science, and she created the Worldwide Indigenous Science Network. And it's a network of native elders and healers all over the planet who some of us kind of said they're the global elders. Global elders are different than local elders. Local elders take care of their local community, and local elders and local people don't necessarily like their elders going out into the world and teaching people from other cultures. That's another topic of conversation. But the elders that we connected with did not look at us and say, nope, you can't come in because you're white, or nope, you can't come in because your hair is brown. Like, there is a group of elders around the planet that really are concerned about the state of humanity and are willing to share their knowledge so that we can remember who we are. And that was what these global elders did. They're now ancestors, many of them. But the Indigenous Science Network is still going on. There's still a network of elders. And it's within that network of elders that we were able to exchange knowledge between cultures so that we could see how we're connected. And that's really where the quantum physics came in. So once this group of elders established themselves and connected and met, they then brought in quantum physicists. The most important one at the time, this is F. David Pete. He wrote a book called Lighting the Seventh Fire, and it's the spiritual ways, healing, and science of the Native American. So he's a quantum physicist that is the protege of David Bohm. And David Bohm was the protege of Einstein. So he comes from the lineage of Einstein. He did pass away in the last few years. I was able to personally thank him for his research because he came in, he met Dr. Colorado. She initiated a meeting up in Canada between Native elders. She brought in Humbotsman, she brought in who's Mayan, she brought in Mary Jones, who's Choctaw. So she brought in this group of elders, and she brought in a group of quantum physicists, and they had a meeting. And it was like a bridging between the worlds. And there is a paper that I'll dig up somewhere and share with you about what came out of that meeting. They wrote a paper about it. But really what came out of that meeting is the realization that where quantum physics ends, Indigenous science begins. So there is a meeting point between the Western science and the Western knowing and the Indigenous knowing. There is a meeting place. But where we have maxed out our understanding of what we think we know, that's where Indigenous science begins. So when we're, as Western scientists, constantly looking for the answers, we're using clinicians, we're using placebos, we're using a particular way of thinking and knowing. You've got that CERN project going on in, what is it, Switzerland or wherever they're at. They're using technology, they're using science, and they're using Western mind to dissect creation. But they're not doing it with Indigenous science. So they're digging and digging and digging and digging over here for what they're trying to find an answer to, but they're only digging their own hole. They're not acknowledging that there is a way of knowing in a science that meets them where they're at, but can take where they're at further. And so quantum physics can explain a lot, but there is a certain point at which quantum physics feeds into Indigenous science, and Indigenous science can explain all of it. because it doesn't isolate quantum physics to explain it all. It doesn't isolate mathematics to explain it all. It includes all of that in its explanation of how everything's connected.
Wow. I have one more question, and
Sure.
that is, you mentioned about the energy lines. If I really look back into the Ice Age, and maybe the time before, even before that, let's say we talk about 24,000 years ago, the axis of the Earth does change time to time. It's all connected, the cosmos. So do you think one is electromagnetism, which results in the energy lines, and is it also the position of stars that has some effect on it?
I mean, I think it's all of it. There's a lot of people that talk about the changes in climate or the changes in nature or all the things going on. I think there's a mindset that thinks that the way things are the way it's going to be forever. And I think that thinking is the problem. Things change, things transform. There's a really good movie called Time Machine, and I love that movie because it shows a point in time, and then like 200 years go by, and how in that particular place and point in time, a city can be built, a city can be destroyed. Like all these things can happen at this one particular location in time. But as you observe, it's not going to stay the same forever. So the Earth is a living being. It's got a consciousness. It has an intelligence. That intelligence, I don't assume to be able to explain the intelligence of it. What I do observe is that things change over time. That winter isn't exactly in the exact same months that they were in my childhood. Summer isn't the exact same temperature as it was in my childhood. Things change over time. Electromagnetic energetics change. There are sacred sites that you go to and there's nothing there. There's no energetic there. The frequency isn't there. It hasn't been utilized. It hasn't been activated. There are some sacred sites that have been there since time began. And I'm sure 20,000 years ago, you could go to that place and that energetic is still exactly the same. The example I have is Mount Shasta, located in Northern California. I lived on Mount Shasta while I was in graduate school for 2 years, and I actually just came back from Mount Shasta about 5 days ago. And Mount Shasta is not a stone circle. It is not a pyramid, but it's recognized as one of the most profound and important sacred sites on the planet. There's many natural places on the earth that have a significant energetic and spiritual presence for people from all over the world. So I feel like there are things around the earth that have been somewhat stationary. So the energetics of that place have been consistent. But I also think that with the shifting of the earth axis, the changes of the sun, the changes of the climate, our impact on the earth, all of our utilization of resources has changed the way the sacred sites operate. So there are many sacred sites of indigenous tribes, indigenous people that are natural and also human-made that have been desecrated. And the energetics, may or may not be there. So I think there's a lot to the question you're asking. I think that things change over time. Energy lines change over time, but the earth is also a living being. And like the earth, we have an energetic field that is consistent, but sometimes we eat really crappy and our bodies get big, or we get malnourished and our bodies get small. I think the earth is the same. There's going to be changes over time on the structure of the earth, on what the earth looks like, because we change too. But there's also a consistent energy that gives things life, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's very clear. It's a very good comparison. I could totally relate to it and easily understand. Yeah,
Good, good.
thanks. And yeah, so moving to the next segment, I'm a little bit curious to know how did ancient cultures read the sky? Like, if I have to understand it as a really newbie or like someone coming from the modern times,
Mm-hmm.
reading all the books, like
Mm-hmm.
specifically, physics, chemistry, mathematics, and thinking that these are like separate subjects, even biology. How would you help me to
Yeah.
understand this? How did ancient cultures read the sky?
Well, I think the best template I have is the one that I used, and I was taught to find the creation stories specific to my ancestors. So I started with Ireland because it was the most obvious with my what I look like because I'm adopted. So I went up to my elder and I'm like, I don't know where to begin. I don't have any names. And she looks at me and she laughs and she walks me over to a mirror, puts me in front of it, and she goes, "Look in the mirror. What do you see? Or who do you see?" And I looked and I said, "Well, I have fair skin and freckles and blue eyes and red hair." And she goes, "Well, where do you think your people come from?" So then I was like, "Well, let's start with Ireland because that seems to be the most obvious." So I started with Ireland and I started learning about the creation stories. And there are many books. Geoffrey of Monmouth was a great resource. There are many books that talk about how my Irish ancestors viewed specific constellations in the sky and who those beings were and what their stories are. So the most sort of obvious is astrology. When you look up in the sky, we're kind of taught that on a certain ecliptic there is there is Cancer, there is Gemini, there is Scorpio. And so different phases of the moon will go through those different constellations and create an energetic that has been translated for eons. So that was like kind of my first introduction was astronomy and how astronomy languages the sky. And I was fascinated with it. I wanted to know more. I wanted to know if there were any UFOs or aliens out there. That's really where I was going with all of it. I wanted to make contact. And so then I started learning a little bit more about the technology of the stars. And so, still in my very beginning process of decolonization, I was learning the name of the Big Dipper. The Big Dipper in my culture is not necessarily the deep tribal culture, but on the story level, the Big Dipper is King Arthur. And so there's this whole Arthurian pantheon that's mapped out over astrology in the sky. So I started learning the different names of the different goddesses and the different characters in the stories and how they're in the sky. Well, then, I could go to Dr. Finch, who's an Egyptologist, an Egyptian scientist, and he could tell me the stories of his ancestors and how they're particular beings in the sky. So it became a way to understand the relationship we have to our ancestors and the stories. The stars became a way for us to remember our stories. Then the other part of it is that when we first started going to the big island of Hawaii and the island of Maui, we were studying with a kapuna who is an elder in the carving tradition. And as an elder in the carving tradition, he took us to the mokulele, which is a canoe that was built from genetic memory. They built a canoe and sailed it on the ocean without any map of how to build it. So they used the pi ratio, they used the golden mean, and they built the mokulele and they sailed it. Well, the way that we know to navigate the sky has, been passed down to those that are captains on boats or people that navigate the seas. You have to know the sky and the stars to be able to have your direction. Yes, we can use technology, but if technology doesn't work, then what do we rely upon? What did our ancestors rely upon? They relied upon the position and the movement of the stars to navigate direction. And so that navigational direction is contained in a sacred site. So the sacred site is kind of like the school for learning navigation. If you spent 365 days a year at Stonehenge every day looking at the sky and mapping out the movement of the stars, you would see a map. Underneath that is the stories of who the star beings are, but then you would also get the map of the solstices and equinoxes and the cycles that are also reflected in how the plants grow around the sacred site. So it's all kind of connected. So how did they use the stars? How did we use the stars? We used it to navigate, which we still do today. We used it to pass down our stories of our ancestors and who the important people in our cycles of time are. And also now into more modern astrology, we use it to help navigate the energy of each day specific to when we were born. So there's many applications of how to use the stars, but over time, we've lost our language. So we've lost the meaning of what it means. So most people can say, oh, well, that's the Big Dipper, and oh, that's Cassiopeia, and oh, that's, Cancer. Some of it comes out of Greek mythology. Some of it comes out of German language. Some of it comes out, it's like how we talk about it comes from a dissociated, fragmented, Eurocentric agreement to speak English. If we were to decolonize all of that and go deeper, we could look at the stars from the viewpoint of how our ancestors did, which would be to give each of the constellations the names specific to the stories that we come from.
Okay. Yeah, I'm still imagining, I'm still thinking.
Yeah. I mean, it's like we're still using some of the tools, but the deeper meaning of what it means that resonates with who we are. And that gives us a sense of purpose on this planet as people who are connected to each other and all living things. We've been dissociated from that. So in the act of colonization, by taking away our languages and by taking away our abilities to talk about these matters, in my culture, there was an inquisition. Redheads were the first to get put on the stake. The things I talk about, I would be killed for. Easily. The concoctions I create, the remedies I make out of plants, the ways that I know, I would be considered a witch and burned at the stake. So now we live in a day and age where in the reality I live in, that doesn't happen. But on a psychological level, it still does. So if we were to talk about this to a group of people eating at McDonald's, they would probably think we were nuts, that we were conspiracy, that we were new age. They'd come up with some terminology to deal with what we're talking about because it makes us uncomfortable, because it's not in our frame of reference as an English-speaking Eurocentric thinker. So my feeling is that it's important to talk about these things again. It's important to engage in these conversations with everyday people and with scientists. It's very important that everyday people and archaeoastronomers and Western scientists decolonize so that we can have an exchange of knowledge of what these things mean on a deeper level. But we can't make people do that work. So there are networks around the planet of indigenous scientists, of people who decolonize, of people who exchange this knowledge and information that you could jump into and be like, wow, I'm going for a ride. Conversations like this are happening all the time. It just depends on where we're at with our awareness, with our language, with our consciousness, to enter these deeper levels of understanding of what those stones and stars really mean, beyond going to the sacred site and standing in front of it and taking your picture and putting it on your wall. There is, it just depends on where somebody's at on their journey, what they want, what they're ready for, and what they're ready to know. And that's what I love about archaeoastronomy, indigenous science, and sacred sites, is I could go there with a group of people we could all be looking at the same thing and experiencing the same stones, but getting completely different sets of information, depending on where we're at on that journey connected to our own ancestors and our own tribal ways of knowing.
Yeah, it makes sense to solve this one big puzzle, being on this planet, so much we don't know. At least in the modern times, it's somehow lost or probably not recorded or probably not taught as a basic skill in the schools or
No,
not talked
no.
about that much. So it's a little bit sad, definitely.
I mean, it's talked about on a daily basis in my home. When my daughter was 2 years old, I would jokingly throw out the big words like decolonization or acidophilus or all the things that I wanted her to have in her head when she was an adult. So I have consciously raised my children speaking my native languages, taking them to powwows and taking them to tea ceremonies and connecting them to cultures, seeing how it's connected, but also to know their own culture, to know our culture. So I have consciously raised my children this way. It is challenging for them to carry on this knowledge, but as they get older and I'm still consistent with my sharing of what I know, it's starting to sink in and it's starting to be passed down through them. And that's really what I was taught is sort of the point of all of this is to pass it down to the next generations so they have access of how to deal with everything that's going on the planet. Like what help does a stone circle or a star system give us today in this moment in time with everything going on the planet? How can it possibly help us? And for me, I draw upon that knowledge every single day. It helps me every single day to feel the connection to the cycles of nature, the cycles of the plants and the stars and the moon and the sun. I know what cycle the moon is in. I know what the sun is doing today. I know where my plants are at. And there's also room for how much I don't know. Something can come in and like we can get a hailstorm out of nowhere and it could wipe out my garden. There's always that unknown. And I think that's what keeps me going is knowing that there is always an unknown and I don't know what it is. And I'm going to stay open to that because it helps me to not stay stuck in what I think I know. If I get stuck in what I think I know, I should not be talking. It's still, I'm learning, I'm still growing. I might teach others what I know. I might be a mentor or a consultant, but I'm also still learning. And I think that's the most important part of my journey is I may have been doing this for studying stone circles for 30 years, but I'm still a student and I'm still learning.
I think it's a bliss to have a curious mind.
It's a lot of fun. Never a dull moment.
Yeah. And back in those times, like let's say they did not have telescopes, if I think from the lens from today's time. So just my question is, how were ancient cultures, they were not using telescopes. What was it?
Well, here's the thing. This is why it's a bit of a mental gymnastics, I think. If you put into place the construct of past, present, and future coexisting simultaneously, that's an Indigenous Science precept. It's the construct of time. If there is no linear time, then somebody from what we call the past can go any time into the future and get information because it's always there. It's not like 3,000 years ago was so long ago, I'll never be able to remember what they were doing. It's actually happening right now in the past. The future is happening right now in the future. It's all happening right now. It's just what skill set am I going to use to navigate getting there? We have a Western mind. I have a Western mind. I have a colonized Western mind that has perpetuated colonized mind thinking for generations. But now I've broken free from those chains and now I'm decolonizing. Well, now I've come out of the closet with my skill set of lucid dreaming. So in my dreams, my whole life, I could go anywhere in time as I've learned to navigate it. Not necessarily control it, but ask permission on where I can go. I could go anywhere in time at any time frame and get information or have a visit. So to answer your question, in the construct of Indigenous science, the technology of how to navigate the stars with instruments, with the mind, with intuition, it's always been there. It's always been there. So how do they access it? Through dreams, through telepathy, through intuition, through observation, through all of these skills that we use today, but some of them we don't. We don't communicate telepathically in Western science with cannabis to learn its healing remedies. I do. When scientists are studying it on a federal level to see if it works for medical patients, they're using a placebo. They're not communicating with the plant and having the plant tell them what they need to know. So it's a very different way of getting information. The Western mind, as a Western mind researcher, we like to dig, we like to find, we like to put things together, we like to dissect and isolate so we can study something. In Indigenous science, as a researcher, I'm communicating with that oak tree. I'm listening. I'm receptive. It's about a relationship with that cannabis plant. It can tell me what it needs. I don't need to tell it what it should do. It's about receptivity. It's about relationship. It's about really humbling myself to come into what it is that I'm supposed to know versus thinking I've studied it, I've gotten a degree in it, and I know it. So it's a very different way of getting information. Using a limited Western mind only gives you a fraction of what's really going on in terms of information. But we're not using our intuitive skills, our telepathic skills, our insight, our second sight skills to do research. It's not accepted as a research methodology in Western science. So when I taught at Portland State and I taught research methodologies, I taught all of the Indigenous science research methodology skills that I learned. I allowed it in my classroom. That's really what it's about. I'm in charge of the classroom. What do I allow? I allowed the Western mind, the back door of the Western mind to open through decolonization. And I allowed for students to have dreams at night and write down their dreams. I allowed them to have hunches and gut feelings, write it down. What is the gut feeling you're getting? You have a synchronicity. You're thinking about something. You walk into the bookstore and right in front of you is a picture of the thing you're thinking about. Write that down. All of those little messages and clues and signs are all part of the research methodology. Indigenous science allows it. So how did they know how to navigate? Because they used a completely different mind to understand where to go and how to get there. It's not a mind that's separate. It's part of the whole mind. So when I talk about Western mind and I talk about Indigenous mind, they're not separate. They're part of the same mind. I can't isolate my Western mind over here and my Indigenous mind over here. It's all the same mind, but I've only been using half of it, is the way I look at it. So if I include the other half, which is my Indigenous mind, it can show me the map of the star system to the stone circle and the journey to get there. It can give me the 18 million year genealogy lineage. But if I was to just isolate myself over here in time and space, and I was to go to ancestry.com, I couldn't find it. So it's kind of depends on where your awareness is at, where your decolonization process is at, and if you're really utilizing your whole mind to the point of a place of self-awareness and observation. There's a whole other set of skills that are accessed when balancing one's own duality of Western and Indigenous and utilizing that observer from that other perspective. You can see way more. So many of the elders that can see from that level have passed. And so we would only hope that they have gotten to as many of us around the planet to keep this way of knowing alive and nurtured. But, you know, in the modern mainstream world, it's cut off. So I appreciate these conversations because it keeps it alive, it keeps it moving, it can be continued to be passed down to the next generation of kids who absolutely love talking about dreams and intuition and aliens and UFOs, and kids love this stuff. And it's as we grow up, we get sort of cut off from talking about it. And I'm not having that. I'm not having that with my kids. It's been on the table since the day they were born. So I would pray that these ways of knowing that the elders have communicated to many of us around the planet, that they continue, so that we can study science and we can study some of the conundrums on the planet with a point of view that is more holistic and healed from the point of view of the doctor or the researcher or scientist. I wish for doctors and scientists to heal that fragmented, dissociated, intergenerational trauma self that they carry, because then the science that they're discovering things from, the book of knowledge will be way more accessible and open to what it is that we're trying to inquire about. But with things like anthropology and archaeoastronomy, we're limited to a certain construct of speaking and thinking and listening. Indigenous science and decolonization opens it up to a book of books. Like, as we're just talking in this brief conversation, it's overwhelming. There's encyclopedias of knowledge when you include Indigenous science. With Western science, there's only so far we can get, and we can't figure things out. And there's a reason why. So if we include our whole self and our whole brain and our ancestors in our scientific approach, we will find solutions to many of our problems, which are contained, encoded in the sacred sites.
Can meditation at some deep levels help in this too?
Oh yeah, I mean, for me, it's a key. It's sort of a crossover between prayer and meditation and chants. They're all kind of in the same, I guess, spiritual toolbox of when I go to a place, I am open to how I need to be in that place and be present. So typically, before I enter into a conversation, a sacred site, or a temple or knowledge, I will ask permission. I will somewhere leave an offering. So I will pray, and then I will go into that place. And typically, what I've learned to do is to meditate. And it's in that state of meditation where I'm not chattering away at the thoughts in my head. I'm fully present with the space and the people and the place, so that if something occurs or a word comes in or something I feel, I can attend to it because I'm not distracted. So meditation for me is and prayer, they're kind of interconnected in some way, is a way for me to prepare my mindset for the platform that I'm entering. It's kind of like, I think I'm an athlete and a dancer from years ago, and I would usually visualize before I would go into a competition. I would usually visualize what it is that I was going into, and then when I would get in there, it's like I would not separate myself, but clear the airwaves so that there weren't the distractions of the day and my children and my dogs when I'm in that environment. So meditation allows for clarity, it allows for receptivity, and it allows for listening. And for me, that equals instruction or information or protocol. If I'm not quiet, then I won't get the message. And meditation allows for that. Prayer, I feel, is important because it's a mental, verbal acknowledgement of respect and integrity. But then once I'm in, the tool that I use is meditation as a way to be present, be quiet, and to observe and listen and be receptive. So I don't know how I would know what I know without these spiritual, I guess, for lack of a better word, tools to be present in these places, to record things, to write things down, or to draw or to paint after I've been in an experience of something. It is that meditative state that allows me to leave that experience and then go back and draw upon it as needed. Meditation is very powerful. It's what allows me to sit in a circle for 4 hours and listen to a ceremony or an elder speak. Meditation can be uncomfortable at times, but it also allows for the opportunity to break through discomfort and get to a place of receptivity to listen and receive knowledge and information. And that's what I do 100% of the time when I go into a stone circle or a sacred site, is I pray and I meditate. And when I come out, that's where I get active. Whether it's move my body, get in water, go take a hike, or write it down. I leave all of that at the door. I go in for my experience. And then when I come out, I'm like, okay, what do I do? How do I integrate this into action? But meditation creates the pause for the receptivity.
Yeah. No, it totally makes sense. I think you really grounded all the things with a lot of good examples, and that one could associate with. You really simplified the whole subject. That's what I'm trying to say.
Oh, good.
So
That's my goal.
really cool. So that almost brings us to the end of this episode. It was so nice to speak about so many things which are really interconnected, and the whole lot of knowledge for me and for my listeners too. And definitely looking forward to have more interesting episodes in the future, because I think there's a huge bunch that we did not even touch.
Well, that's the beginning, the beauty of this. And I appreciate your receptivity, your questions. I can see, it's a lot to take in that makes my mind spiral just even talking about it. But you've been a very gracious host in asking questions that I think are helping to take something that's so deeply profound, psychological, philosophical, spiritual, and to bring it into everyday practical life. That's what it's about. And that's what I wish to do, that's what I do with the work I do, is to take these really deep constructs and bring them forward so that it can be digestible to, somebody in preschool. It has to be accessible to the kids. And the younger the kids are exposed to the idea that we all have ancestors and we all have indigenous knowledge, and that this knowledge can help us get through the day, the month, the year, and our life. I would wish for this to be able to be simplified for children so that, we can be raised in this way of knowing, so that we're not constantly looking for answers in places that we'll never find them.
Absolutely. I agree.
Yeah. So thank you so much for your questions and for finding me on the internet. Like it's a blessing.
Yeah.
It's
likewise.
A blessing.
I'm really happy to be connected with you. But before ending it, would you recommend some books on today's subject? Just a starter kit, or some simple books.
Yeah. So the three books that come into mind that I started with when I started graduate school. The first one is Lakota Star Knowledge, Studies in Lakota Stellar Theology. It really shows in a native way the connection between the stars and the stones and the cosmic cycles and the language around it and what it means. And I like it because it's a great template for somebody who's not native to know what to look for when looking within my own tribes and clans and indigenous science knowledge. So with Lakota Star Knowledge, I think it's equally as important to look at this book that was probably one of the most profound, gut-wrenching, grieving books I ever read, which is Native American Post-Colonial Psychology. And for me, it was the effects of what it means for my ancestors to have fled genocide and come to this land, and what happened to the tribes of this land, whose knowledge I want to seek out because I want to know more about my own culture. So it's important to acknowledge the decolonization process and also the, treasure of knowledge that indigenous science brings. So these two books are great to better understand native ways of knowing and decolonization through a native lens. I also highly recommend F. David Pete, Lighting the Seventh Fire. He is a quantum physicist who met an indigenous elder and went into these meetings and wrote a book about indigenous science from the perspective of a quantum physicist. And it dramatically changed his life from the minute he met Dr. Colorado. And he incorporated indigenous science into everything he did as a quantum physicist because of that. The last book, well, there's two more books. The Sun and the Serpent by Hamish Miller and Paul Broadhurst. It's a really great book on the stone circles and cairns specific to England. There's also The Stars and the Stones by Martin Brennett, which is specific to Ireland. And then there's my own doctoral dissertation, which I'm working on publishing, which is called Remembering Our Ancestors, Recovery of Indigenous Mind as a Healing Process for the Decolonization of Western Mind, which is really my template or map of how I started as a kid that liked to dream. I was a DJ and a raver in Oregon, and I just had these dreams. And so this dissertation is really my journey of the steps and process that I went through to recover my indigenous ways of knowing, to then situate myself in my excitement and my passion for star knowledge and sacred sites. So I'll put out a list of references and send that to you, and let's continue the conversation. It's really exciting.
Definitely. Thanks again for your time, Dr. Paula. It
Absolutely.
was awesome. It was great speaking with you, and looking forward to meeting more in the future.
Yes, absolutely. Dia Gwetch.
Thanks. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Bye.